give this just a minute to sort of do its thing.
Sure.
I will pull up all my notes.
That's right. I sent you a bunch of notes.
There we go. Get rid of that. Pull that up. Pull that up. All right, man. You ready to rock?
I am ready to rock and roll.
Sweet. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wit and Wisdom. My name is Corey DeVos, editor-in-chief here at Integral Life. And with me, as always, is my very good friend and integral therapist par excellence, Dr. Keith Witt. Dr. Keith, how you doing, man?
Doing really good today. It's raining in Santa Barbara. It's nice to get some water into our drought-ridden area.
Nice. Yeah, it's starting to sort of thaw out around here, which is good. And, today we're going to be talking about something that's, a bit provocative. We're calling this month's episode, The Psychology of Kink, which is, it's an important topic when it comes to things like our overall sexual health and fulfillment, and as well as creating a more intimate and rewarding connection in our relationship. And really, if anything else, maybe this show will give us a few new strategies to, sort of stay warm during the polar vortex we're experiencing right now. So, I hope everyone brought your, whips and ropes and ball gags, because this is going to be a fun episode. And, before we start, Keith, it's always seemed to me in the topic of kink, it always seemed to me that kink is really such an apt word when we're talking about this, because, if we don't allow ourselves to bring some more mindfulness, some more self-acceptance to our deepest desires and fantasies, and if we can't find a healthy outlet for these things, then it really can create sort of a kink in our system, which is like, kinking a garden hose. And this prevents our sexual energy from, really from moving where it wants to and where it needs to move. And when this energy gets stuck in somewhere in our system, it can lead to all sorts of different fixations and obsessions and even dangerous behaviors, and kind of keeps us trapped in this prison of our own libido. So in a way, the goal here, I think, is to sort of integrate our kinks by unkinking our kundalini and our sexual energy in general, so that it can move more freely. So Keith, can you help us out a bit here?
Well, first of all, I agree with your analysis, which is a Freudian analysis, which is somewhat ironic. Freud was the first person that came up with the energetic theory of cathexis and counter-cathexis of energies, and blocked cathexis and so on. But unfortunately, Freud also was the guy who came up with the psychoanalytic theory that pathologized pretty much every non-traditional form of sexuality there was. And in the relationship between psychotherapy and psychology and kink, that's causing a lot of problems over the last 20 years, 120 years. Hopefully, and in a lot of ways, those problems have been changing. And, somebody wrote me an email when this was advertised. He says, "Oh, Keith, you're so brave to talk about kink." And I go, that's really a reflection of the lower left and the lower right taboos around sex that most cultures have. And we're really complicated in the United States because, there are taboos with red culture, amber culture, orange and green. And, they're all somewhat different sets of taboos. And since our moral development is included and transcend, by the time we make it to teal, we have sexual taboos from 4 or 5 levels of moral development that we have to deal with from our unconscious. Causes a lot of problems. So yeah, let's talk about this. So first of all, the traditional definition of kink is people that have non-alternative sexual experiences like BDSM. BDSM is bondage, discipline, top, bottom, sadomasochism, master slave, all put together in BDSM. Probably the most coherent sexual subculture in the country of kink. But also it's fetishes, it's gender fluidity, pansexualism, polyamory, multiple partners, that kind of stuff. All of that kind of comes together as defined as kink. And they used to be called the paraphilias by the pathologizing psychological structure. And now in 2013, something very cool happened. The DSM-5 stopped pathologizing alternative sexuality. They say it's only a problem if it causes a lot of problems for the person, or if it causes a lot of problems for relationships, or if it's coercive or abusive in some fashion. And that's a big deal. That's kind of similar to what happened in 1973 when the DSM-3 said that being homosexual isn't pathological. Now, my relationship with the establishment of psychology is in the 60s and the 70s. And so I was kind of in the front line getting in people's faces about things like pathologizing homosexuality. And particularly in the 70s, when I was working with couples, I realized there just wasn't much training working with sexuality, and that couples with fulfilling sexuality were happier couples. So I became certified as a sex therapist with the American Association of Sex Educators and Sex Therapists. Did a lot of sex therapy training, and then I trained some people myself. Eventually resigned when the ASCT wouldn't accept continuing education credits from their rival organization, the Society for the Scientific Study of Sex. And that kind of stuff happens. I go, count me out. But they've since reconciled, which tells me don't always resign from an organization when it does something that you find offensive. And my trainers were very pro-sexual, and they were pro-kink. And even though the Integral wasn't around then, at least around for me and for them, they basically had that felt appreciation for all points of view. And their sense is, if there's stuff between consensual adults that isn't hurting anybody, we're for it. And that's true from pretty much all sex therapists, because you don't get very far as a sex therapist if you pathologize what gets somebody off. Okay. If I go to somebody's sex therapy and I go, well, this thing turns me on, I don't know, whatever, BDSM, cross-dressing, fetishes or something. And they go, oh, well, that's a paraphilia, you got to get rid of that. Then I'm not very happy with that. If they say, well, what's the healthy expression of your BDSM? What's the healthy expression of cross-dressing? What's your healthy expression of your fetish, and so on? And how can we make that to make you a happier, more fulfilled person, an integrated person, and happier relationship? They like that. And so people who've done sex therapy, as I have over the years, tend to have that orientation. Now, here's my definition of kink. That's more of an integral definition. If you find something exciting that you have an internalized cultural standard that says it's bad, you have a kink. Okay. Now, you can tell that that's given the fact that there should be 30 genders, not just 2. Given the fact that everybody has unique sexuality, given the fact that human beings take the drives and turn them into art, and art is unique, and the sexual drives are, among the most urgent of our drives. What that says is everybody pretty much has a kink of some sort. And if we just look at the traditional definitions of kink, in Canada, 50% of people say that they're interested in kinky stuff, and 33% have tried kinky stuff. 64% of Americans say they think about it. 14% of guys, 11% of women do it regularly. And there's as many people who self-identify as part of kinky communities like BDSM, and there's a diaper community in the Pacific Northwest. As many people as self-identify as kinky as identify as gay. So it's a huge subculture that has been below the radar forever. And there's a lot of misconceptions about these subcultures. And the one that's been most heavily studied is the BDSM one. It seems to be the most coherent and most organized. So here are some misconceptions about kink. One misconception about kink is that if you're kinky, that means you had some kind of trauma that caused you to be kinky. So the best research that's been done has found no correlation between trauma and kinkiness. Very much like they never found any correlation between trauma and being gay. And so that assumption that was made by a lot of therapists isn't borne out by the current data. Okay. Another misconception is that at least the BDSM kinky sex is like the BDSM sex you see in porn. Not at all. BDSM sex is very, very thoughtful. It's very, very considered. It's very negotiated. It's not like that at all. It's very respectful. Here's another one. Another misconception is people who are in a kink have some kind of psychological problem. Well, there are these studies done by the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom and some others by the Janus Corporation, the Janus organization up in San Francisco. And they found that just the opposite. People that were involved in kink communities were more conscientious, more extroverted, less neurotic, more open to new experience, and had less fear of rejection. Which is not surprising to me as a therapist, because over the years, people that have come in, couples that take their sexuality seriously, their love affair, because, you know, relationship is that love affair, that friendship, and the capacity to repair injuries. People that take their love affair seriously and put energy into it do a lot better. And people who are part of a kink community take their sexuality very seriously and put a lot of energy into it with each other. Not surprising to me that statistically they do better. Now, those studies were funded by the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom and Janus Corporation, so there must be some confirmation bias. So, you know, there needs to be more research about all this stuff. Another misconception is that kinky stuff, particularly BDSM, means some people are being dominated and abused and that kind of stuff. And I'm sure that happens, but at least in the BDSM community, that is forbidden. It's the watchwords in that community are safe, sane, and consensual. And so their standards are very, very conservative around safe, sane, and consensual. And practically speaking, just as a person and as a therapist, when somebody comes to see me and they have a kink, my first thought is, okay, how can we use this kink, whatever it is, to help you have a happier life? And if it's a relationship, how can we help you have a better relationship? And this also it causes some kinds of problems in a relationship, because if you have something that you really like and your partner has sexual disgust for it or sexual shaming about it, that really causes a lot of problems. For two people to engage in an act, each person has to find it just a little bit positive. They don't have to be equally turned on, but you know, if you find it neutral or negative, then you can give your partner gifts, but you can't really participate in kinky stuff that they like. And, you know, I've worked with lots of couples. I've worked with couples that are into master slave stuff and BDSM stuff and transvestite stuff and, you know, foot stuff and semi-public sex stuff and just all of it. And the ones that actively do it do quite well. I know one couple that was fun. They were having a vacation in LA, and one of their field trips was to the sex toy store in Hollywood, where they were going to get, you know, sex toys. And that was a really good sign for that couple. So, and then now, that being said, there's lots of crazy stuff that happens, and there's lots of crazy stuff that happens with everybody's sexuality and so on. And that includes kink. And, you know, when you're dealing with intense experience like BDSM does, or when you're dealing with people that have intense feelings, like you feel if you have something that gets you off, there can be harm. And especially there can be harm around shame and moral disgust. Why? Like I said, you know, we grow through different moralities that roughly track red, amber, orange, green, teal. And each one of those has their own prohibitions and taboos about sex. For those of you that have seen The Sopranos, you might remember there was a series of episodes where one of the captains was beaten to death because he was a gay bottom. You know, the fact that he was a gay bottom was unacceptable in that red culture. It was punishable by death. In amber culture, we all know where the missionary position came from. The missionaries said you can only have sex if you're married and you're trying to have children and the guy's on top. Missionary position. You know, huge agrarian prohibitions around sex. Huge form of social control.
Don't you dare enjoy it.
Don't you dare enjoy it. Okay. You know, female circumcision in Africa, which is way down now as the world becomes less violent. Orange, interestingly, orange stuff is you don't want to look bad. So I've had couples come in who are in good shape and they say we're best friends and they get along really well and they're great with their kids and their kids are doing well at school, but they're sexually alienated from each other and they're afraid to talk about it because it'll make them look bad because, you know, you want to be a winner and you want to look like a winner if you're orange. And we all have stories of people in green where some guy wants to ravish or some woman wants to be ravished or a guy wants to be ravished and a woman wants to ravish. Because we have hardwired sexual arousal systems for a guy for men generally of possessing their partner and a woman of surrendering to the right guy, the right time, taking her. And so people who want to do that can be pathologized by green cultures. And so we internalize those standards. And then as we discover, so the culture gives us standards. Mm-hmm. Then we discover what gets us off. If we discover there's something that gets us off, that it goes against the cultural standard, we feel shame. We want to hide it. And if there isn't some kind of way of opening up in the little community, even if it's a community of 2 or 3 people, that interior shame causes the kind of kinks that you're talking about that causes people to feel distressed. You know, that certainly happened with me when I was developing. I'm kind of a pansexual guy, which is unusual for someone who's been monogamous with the same woman since 1982. But, you know, there it is. And so as I discovered that about myself in a really rigid homophobic, you know, society, I felt a lot of shame. And so psychotherapy was a great way for me of learning about myself and accepting and integrating that and changing those primitive moral structures. And that's really the way that you want to go when you find some aspect of your sexuality that you're ashamed of. You want to go, okay, so what value am I, what rule am I breaking? What value am I violating? And if you find that value is an outmoded value, like, well, I'm not supposed to be a gay bottom, or I'm not supposed to, you know, like a doggy style, or I'm not supposed to, you know, like to be tied up or tie somebody up, or I don't like, you know, whatever. I don't like to admit that I like to ravish, or I don't like to admit that I like to be ravished. Then you can go, how can I refine that value to accept that fit more with my advancing edge moral system, which most of us is an exit green, which is a radical acceptance, or a teal, which is real radical acceptance without that green shadow of secret disapproval and so on. Now, this all sounds easier than it is. Like, I don't have very much moral disgust for, you know, it's interesting how disgust comes online at 4 or 5 and shame comes online around 1. And moral and disgust happens either with stuff that's icky or with stuff that's immoral or with stuff the sexual stuff that doesn't match what we like, which is where a lot of the weird laws come from. You know, when I was first in college, there were sodomy laws. It was against the law. It was against the law in a lot of states for adults to do sodomy with each other.
Yeah, I think in Texas they have a law currently that says you can own a maximum of like 2 dildos.
Oh no!
It's not exactly clear to me how they enforce that law.
Wow, I'm glad I don't live in Texas. I would have to go. I'd have to go choose. You know, geez. I mean, how do you choose 2? I mean, anyway. So yeah, there was just this fucking crazy stuff. I mean, you can see why when we were hippies, we rejected institutions. It's like, once you wake up to that stuff, it's hard to be polite about it. You know, and of course that, you know, that's green outrage, and green outrage doesn't help anybody. You know, you need to be respectful.
Right.
And so now, almost anybody in the kink community has a story of someone who was shamed or pathologized by some therapist. You know, who is icked out by what they did, and you know, it's great to say to be accepting, but you know, sometimes it's hard. There was a guy I worked with once, and his big passion was creating a lifelike artificial woman figure that he could fuck. Okay, and he really was excited about that. Now, I basically had sexual disgust for that. I didn't have moral disgust. I mean, it was fine with me morally that he wanted to do it, but just the process of him having sex with that thing or creating a thing was kind of icky to me. And I'm sure I communicated that subtly to that guy. And I'm sorry I did, but I did, I'm sure. Um, and you know, so that kind of stuff happens. And so as therapists, part of the work is always becoming aware of those forces in you and then continuing to make your own adjustments.
Right.
Because, you know, you got to be able to empathize with what is exciting and what's wonderful and what's a turn on to somebody. And, you know, also, you know, often when couples come in, particularly these days, a lot of people don't discover that they like kink until they're older. Like in the old days, people didn't discover they really were gay until they were in their 20s or 30s or even 40s. And so what they'll do if they have a partner who isn't into it is they'll go to porn sites and do it. And then their partner discovers them and it's a big deal and everybody's all ashamed. And they get diagnosed as a sex addict.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sex addiction really exists. And I've had clients who are sex addicts who needed the recovery programs that exist around the country and so on. But it runs the risk of being overdiagnosed when you have a partner that feels sexual disgust or sexual shame for whatever her partner or his partner is into. And that's just something to be aware of. And part of the psychology of kink is being aware that all of these forces are acting in culturally and interiorly with people with these very, very, very powerful drives. And taking them into account and helping people with them is challenging, but, you know, fruitful. Polyamory is another good example of that. We have drives to be jealous. You know, if we see somebody being with our partner, there's a drive, a mate protection that comes up. So in the polyamory community, there have been endless discussions and experimentations about how do you manage jealousy in a non-exclusive relationship. It always turns up. It always causes problems.
Right.
And, you know, people have had varying levels of success with that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so on and so on and so on.
Yeah. Well, and Keith, before you go on, I just wanted to double click real quickly on the shame piece. Because, you know, last month you and I had a really amazing conversation about, you know, what it takes to overcome shame and negative self-judgments that we impose on ourselves. And this is, you know, obviously something that comes up often when we're trying to come to terms with our various sexual kinks and preferences and desires and so forth. And especially if that kink is in any way related to a previous trauma. Now, you had mentioned usually it's not. But
statistically, according to the research, that's true.
Right. Yeah, usually it's not. If you have a kink, that doesn't mean you have a trauma. However, sometimes it is. Sometimes kink is one way that our mind copes with previous traumas by turning, you know, it's almost like forming this pearl layer by layer over this previous painful trauma. And it's a way of sort of transmuting pain into a source of pleasure. But then if that's the case, it can feel doubly shameful in a certain kind of sense if that kink is not sort of reciprocated when you try to share it. It's sort of, you know, gives you this feeling like, oh, great, you know, so you don't like this beautiful dark secret I've been holding on to my entire life and only share the people I trust the most. Okay, you know what I mean? It can trigger some of those same feelings of trauma again when your kink is not actually when you can't find a space for your kink in your relationship or what have you. And, you know, and obviously, like you're pointing to, sometimes that shame comes from outside of us. It comes from our surrounding culture. And this gets really, really complicated. You know, you mentioned sort of the different kinds of shame that we see by altitude. And with green, it's tricky, right? It's really tricky. On the one hand, it's like, you know, we have sort of a 50-year legacy of like the green sexual revolution where, you know, it's like we feel suddenly empowered to try anything. It's sort of like approaching that Star Trek attitude of sexuality, everything. Infinite diversity and infinite combinations, right? But at the same time, there's like this surreptitious shaming that comes along with it. You know, I'm thinking, for example, modern day feminists in the Me Too era who might fantasize about being dominated by a man, or vice versa, a man who has grown up in this culture that has really, you know, impressed upon him how important it is to never hurt a woman. And now suddenly he's being asked in a consensual relationship to hurt a woman. It can make it very difficult for him, you know, for him to sort of feel his way into that. And it seems like, you know, sometimes our kink really brings us to these, surfaces these conflicting parts of ourselves, and kinds of, can kind of set them against each other, which can feel painful, or it can be really tremendously liberating if we allow ourselves the space to, experiment with playing different roles and opening ourselves to new kinds of experience.
Well, first of all, the first point that you made, the point about trauma being woven into sexuality, is true for most of us to some extent. And so if you happen to be interested in something kinky, that'll get woven into whatever your trauma history is. And also, a culture plays a huge role here. And, there's a question from Loki that I think is a really relevant question. The question is about, but it's a long question, so I'm going to kind of paraphrase it. But there's forms of oppression that have been normalized by social science and therapists, and talking about basically heteronormative standards and so on, that have caused just an awful lot of problems for people. And I think that's a super good point, because that's exactly what has happened. Now, that's happened, with the liberation. First of all, everybody agrees that everybody was suppressed sexually, basically from agrarian society onward. You go down to tribal society, it's hard to say. I mean, there's not much record of it. Some tribal societies seem to normalize a lot of different forms of sexual expression. Some don't. But we all know that agrarian society just pathologized, they objectified women became property, pathologized sex, just, one mess after another. With the liberation movements, there's been progressive levels of awakening, and psychology tried to be progressive. Freud tried to make it scientific. His biases are big, scientific. Now it didn't do a really good job, but it was on the way. And the current standards today are as widely accepting of people doing what serves their health, joy, and love, and accepting themselves for who they are. It is more that today than it's ever been before, and that is the direction of the field of psychology. That's the direction of the APA. That's the direction of psychotherapy. And as we do that, we discover that there are multi-generations of damage that have been done by cultural prohibitions and bigotry and stuff. One example of that, for instance, is the fact that the paraphilias were listed as psychopathology in the DSM until 2013 meant that if one person was kinky in a divorce proceeding, that could be brought up and they could have less access to their children, which was just horrible. Okay. And now it's much more difficult to do that, which is, positive, which is progress. And, one of the things that Loki said about social mob, adjustments, Carl Jung said that when people became inflated, which he meant being too different from, perceived as different from the group had a tendency to attack them. And that was really right. Okay. And so now that we're in the age of the liberation movements, part of what's happening is people are being identified as having unique gender roles, unique sexuality, that kind of stuff. And the idea of being healthy and unhealthy is being somewhat is becoming detached from whatever your gender role or your sexuality is. It's like, you can be a healthy or unhealthy BDSM. You can be a healthy or unhealthy heteronormative. You can be, whatever. And so what that does with psychotherapy is it makes us very practical. So somebody comes in and he likes to dress up and she finds she's neutral about it. Okay, she can participate, but not enthusiastically. Or if she doesn't like it, well, that kind of isolates him. Or she likes being a bottom and she likes, the master slave stuff, and he finds that offensive. Okay, that's a problem. So we have to work with that. Mm-hmm. And with couples, that's always the case. There's what's exciting to her, what's exciting to him, and where it intersects is where their sex life is. We want to expand that, but it never expands to the point that everything that each person finds erotic is included. And that's just part of the negotiation of the love affair. If it's conscious, if it's explicit, if it's sex positive, if it's relationship positive, if it includes improving the friendship, and improving their capacity to heal ruptures and injuries, things tend to go well with that couple or with that individual. And that's important, I think. Uh, one of the biggest problems we have today in this culture is loneliness, isolation. There's more people living alone than ever before, fewer people married than ever before, more people describing themselves as lonely. Half the country do. And so part of that is people being afraid to talk about who they are. So normalizing whatever kink you got and saying, yeah, that's who I am, and that's how I want to kind of deal with the world, and finding ways of doing it in healthy ways, and noticing when you're doing it in an unhealthy way and changing that. I'd like that to be super normal. When I started becoming a therapist, therapists were kind of looked on askance. I would say I'm a psychologist or I'm a therapist in a party, and people would get a little weird in the 70s. Why we were associated with breaking taboos. We were associated with shame. We were associated with interior experiences, forbidden areas. And so there's a little bit of social stigma associated with that. That's not really true today, as far as I can tell. But it happens. And also, I really, more in the 70s and 80s, but I really did encounter some therapists that I thought did a lot of damage with their criticisms and their attacks and their characterizations and their embodiments of cultural norms without self-reflection.
Right.
And, as an integrally informed people always do self-reflection and are always curious about their biases. We all have them, but be curious about them.
Right. Beautifully said. Well, and let's open up the conversation a bit. So for everyone watching, if you are joining us right now through the Zoom app and you want to ask a question, you have two ways to do it. You can either press the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and submit a written question. We'll read it on the air and Dr. Keith will answer. Or you can press the raise my hand button. That'll let us know that you want us to actually turn on your camera and you can ask your question in real time. If you're watching on the integrallife.com/live page, there should be a link right underneath the video player. If you click that, that'll bring you into the Zoom app. You might have to download it real quick. It's totally free if you don't already have it. But that'll allow you to ask your questions. And Keith, while we wait to see if anyone has anything to say here, I'm curious whether in your experience as a relationship counselor, whether you have found that either men or women are more comfortable when it comes to exploring and expressing their kink. And the reason I ask is because, we did a really great talk with Ken Wilber this week. Actually, we released it this week, talking about sex and gender and toxicity. And you and Jeff had an amazing conversation about toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. And a lot of this stuff came up into the air. And one of the things I've really been feeling into is the fact that, between two things, the fact that due to feminism, women have been consciously reshaping their roles and their identity in society for over a century now. And in a lot of ways, it's a process that really men have not begun doing, at least not consciously, not in a sort of, on the same level that we've seen feminism over the last century. So you take that sort of, that conscious rediscovery and redefining of identity and roles, and then you take into consideration the fact that, the birth control pill dropped out of the sky about 50 years ago.
Changed everything.
It changed absolutely everything. Gave women so much more opportunity for sexual agency, and not that women haven't always been sort of the main selective pressure when it comes to human sexuality, but it seemed like it empowered women that much more to really begin that tract of sexual self-discovery in a way that I feel like a lot of men have some trouble with. And another piece of this too, Keith, is the fact that human sexuality is so complex and so multivariant, both in terms of our individual cosmic addresses and in terms of how those cosmic addresses interface with culture. For example, I've always found it interesting that it seems like women have a little bit more space to play with to experiment with their sexual orientation, for example. They can be a little more experimental when it comes to trying sexual relations with other women. Then, men oftentimes don't feel the same kind of freedom. And I think one of the reasons for that is the way culture sort of enacts this. It's almost like if you take two feminine women, put them together, that somehow makes them more feminine. But if you take two masculine men and put them together, it doesn't seem to make them more masculine in quite the same way, at least the way culture kind of holds these kind of polarities and sort of sexual dynamics. So I'm wondering, if you're an experience as a counselor, have you found that women are typically trying to sort of lead the charge here, or is it kind of 50-50?
Well, you said a lot, Corey.
I tend to ramble.
That's all right. So first of all, I'm always a little uncomfortable, a couple of guys talking about women.
That's right.
Now, that being said, I mean, I, as everybody knows, I've done 65,000 therapy sessions and counting, and more than half of them have been with women. So, first of all, the basic understanding that I think Helen Fisher is one of the best persons articulating this. Men and women's sexuality is different. And so understanding that, and Helen Shivers, Meredith Shivers did her research, and a couple of other, Marta Mina have done research. Men and women's sexuality tends to be different. Men's sexuality tends to be more visually oriented and constant, okay, more driven by testosterone, more driving to, release. Women's sexuality, this is statistically speaking, tends to be more, one, contextual. Mm-hmm. And by the way, this is true for all mammals. It tends to be more episodic. It's not visual. It tends to be driven by proprioceptive things, interior stuff. And people go through different stages of sexual bonding, as I've talked about a lot. There's lust, there's romantic infatuation, and there's intimate bonding. And during the intimate bonding stage, there's less sexual urgency. Also, men and women are socialized differently sexually. Both men and women in general are encouraged to suppress their sexuality and suppress sexual talk. That's a problem. Now, testosterone tends to make guys, and because of that visual thing, it makes guys more urgent. Mm-hmm. And so they have less capacity of just kind of suppressing their sexual needs. Women have more capacity to do it. It's less urgent, it's more contextual, and it's more episodic. And girls are taught, don't do it unless you feel like it. But then when you're on the intimate bonding stage of relationship, say you're having a kid and you're tired, you never feel like it until you've been doing it for 5 or 10 minutes. And then you go, God, this was a great idea. Also, women have more social circuits in their brains than men do. Now, those more social circuits means they're a little bit more sensitive to how they're being perceived by the social context. And so they're going to be a little bit more anxious about, wanting to connect, to feel like they're socially okay. Mm. Meanwhile, going back to the destructive aspects of traditional masculine ideology, if a guy finds out that he likes stuff that traditional masculine ideology is contemptuous of, say he likes being a submissive, say he really is likes being emotional, say he wants his partner to be in charge, say that he does better when he's in an environment where he doesn't fit in with the traditional male role. Mm-hmm. There'll be shame associated with that. And then how you deal with that shame is a function of how far advanced you are in the integration of defensive line of development. And do you have some kind of sangha or culture around you that can deal with non-judgmental exploration? Mm-hmm. Psychotherapy does that, but we need more than a psychotherapist. So given all that stuff, over the years, I've seen people have equal difficulties, but the difficulties come from the different orientations that they have, the different genetic drivers that they have, the different cultural pressures and identifications with them that mm-hmm. they have. For instance, when I was a kid developing, um, uh, uh, I wasn't taught about my needs to be intimate. You know, my Aunt Dorothy says that the masculine and the feminine are the two wings of the dove, and a dove can't fly with one wing, which is good teaching. Nobody ever taught me that about pretty much anything, but especially about sex. So when I was 14 or 15, and I was kind of desperate, I thought, for sex. But that's not really, in retrospect, that was an oversimplification. I was desperate for intimacy and secure attachment. I was desperate to have some kind of engagement with the feminine. I wasn't desperate for a woman where we could go deeper with each other, and I could work with a feminine partner in deeply exploring and accepting who I was and who she was. And when I began to find partners like that, that was just great.
Mm.
So the sex was super great. Though, at least for me, it was hard for me to believe that sex really existed until I'd been doing it for about a year and a half. I would wake up and go, did that really happen? I mean, it was so invisible from 60s culture that, it took me a while to believe that it actually, happened. And it took me even more and more and more years to discover my own inhibitions. And also more and more years to recognize that my clients, who I believe trusted me and talked to me about everything, and I always ask people explicit questions about their sexuality. People feel such layers of shame.
Yeah.
I was working with somebody regularly for 6 years before she said, I'm really ashamed of my lesbian fantasy. Speaking of, now going back to statistics, women's sexuality is closer to the center of, gay straight than men are. So women statistically are more likely to be able to be sexually engaged or even romantically engaged with men and women. Just statistically, they tend to have more of that capacity.
Well, and that's always been one of my questions, Keith, is whether that is true in terms of like men and women's natural condition, or whether the statistics are showing that data because of all of these cultural pressures.
It's a cross-cultural finding.
Interesting.
It's true for some animal species. It's interesting to me that 3% of all mammals are gay.
Hmm.
Okay, well, that's not a cultural construct. Okay. So it might be, but in general, it looks like women are more bisexual by nature. It looks like it slightly. Now, that being said, we're human beings. We take the drives and turn them into art. And when we're talking about sex and relationship, we're doing them into co-creative art. And, it's just, art is art. And so there is an infinity of expressions. What do I care about? I care about whether it serves love. I care about whether it's a healthy expression. If it's consenting adults having a good time with each other and serving love, I'm for it.
Yep.
If it's exploitative or somebody is hurting themselves or particularly hurting somebody else in some fashion, I'm not for it. If it's a culture is trying to make somebody feel bad about who they are, I'm on board with who they are. I'm not on board with culture. Okay. What I used to tell my kids, we'd have conversations. So, we had no nudity taboos for the first 7 or 8 years in our family. And I used to tell the kids, in this country, you get in trouble if you run around naked outside. It's like, it was clear. In this country, the culture will give you shit if you were around naked outside. And then around 9, my son was beginning to feel, kind of more, and he was in this culture and he was uncomfortable with nudity in the family. So we all sat down. I said, so, Ethan's getting uncomfortable with us running around naked because, about naked women and stuff, and it's forbidden in the culture. So we're going to have a nudity taboo in the family. He says, well, what's a nudity taboo? And I says, well, so I explained it. Zoe can be naked around mom, and Ethan can be naked around me, but Becky and I can do it. But, the rest of us can't be naked around each other. The kids went, okay. It's like, what? Really? I go, that's a nudity taboo. In this country, there's a nudity taboo, and that's kind of what we do because that's what everybody else does. Okay. Now, what that did with them is it kind of separated out who they were, which was always acceptable, except when they were bigots, and then it wasn't. If one of them started getting down on themselves because they liked handcuffs or they liked, they had a lesbian dream. I said, it's okay to have that, but it's not okay for me for you to be down on yourself because that's being a bigot. And I don't, we have a family's value about not being a bigot. Some great dinner table conversations at the Witt household around that kind of stuff as a kid. And we still have those conversations, and they're a lot of fun, I gotta say.
Right.
So it's so in answer to your question, yeah, it's like that. Now, what heals all this? Well, the dialectic is what heals it. You know, Bina and Suzanne Cook, Bina Sharma and Suzanne Kugruder, when they're working polarities, that's an operationalization of integral. There's a positive and a negative manifestation of almost anything, including sexual stuff. And so let's get interested in that, in examining that polarity, and out of that will come a deeper understanding. And that's the second tier right there.
Right.
And in relationships, that's the second tier in relationships, and specifically sexually. So you find a lot of that with people that have put energy into improving their relationship, collaboratively and cooperatively, and dealing with shadow stuff as it comes out.
Right.
So there you go.
Yeah. Well, we got a question that just came in from an anonymous attendee. How
yeah, right. A lot of it's going to be anonymous today.
Yeah, I'm guessing people aren't showing up on camera today because they don't want to be seen in their fetish gear. So that's, you know, again, guys, there's no shame here. You can come as you are. So Anonymous asks, how does relationship anarchy, which is not a phrase I'm familiar with, how does relationship anarchy, as described in, and they offer a link, how does this relate to integral theory? Are you familiar with relationship anarchy, Keith?
No, I have no idea. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that question because I would have to make up what they mean by relationship anarchy, and I'm sure they have some specific meaning.
Yeah.
So sorry about that. You really can't comment on it because I just don't know what that group means by the concept.
Yeah, but here's another anonymous question that just popped up. Keith, you beautifully summarized the taboos of kink at red, amber, orange, and green. How would you characterize the territory of sexual taboos at teal, turquoise, etc.? Is it strictly a combination of the unintegrated aspects of previous levels, or are there new shadow aspects that show up? Great question.
First of all, these are the kinds of dimensions that make the second tier so much fun. So the answer to it is that sexual taboos show up all the time in teal and turquoise. But by the time you make it into teal and turquoise, and if you're that altitude psychosexually, you have a stable witness that is observing that taboo rise up. And you go, well, here comes a taboo. And then you deal with it. Now we're backing out into flex flow. You deal with it out of your principles of teal and turquoise.
Mm-hmm.
Now, specifically with, if we're going to get more granular about this, with teal, we're working at individual liberation and couples liberation. And so generally when a taboo arises, you kind of want to work with it with your individual liberation and couples liberation. If you have some reflexive taboo that you find that interferes with your acceptance or enjoyment of your sexuality or your partner's acceptance and enjoyment. At turquoise, we have a larger mission. We want to change the culture. It goes back to Loki's question. It's not okay with us that there are cultures around the world that suppress people's sexuality. We want to work together with like-minded people to help those cultures wake up, to help liberate those people. That's more of a sense of urgency for us.
Right.
And that's just the way development works. And I suspect that by the time we begin to get to violet, recently I was talking to a guy about Dune. It's a famous book. And Dune was a seminal book for me because when 1960s, when I was reading it, there was something in it that pointed me towards my current path. There was the hero, Paul Muad'Dib, is the guy who could be many places at once, which kind of was an anticipation of integral. And at one point, there's a famous scene where the villain gives him a Bible and he opens it up to a secret passage. And there is a sense of electricity associated with that passage. And that passage is, think you that a deaf person cannot hear? What deafness then might we not all possess? What senses do we lack that we cannot see and hear another world all around us? So I knew there was another world, and so I wanted to find it, and I did through contemplative practice and martial arts and psychotherapy. And and I access it all the time. I'm accessing it right now. And there's a funny thing about the other world. If you offer the other world a loving intent, it empowers you in that area. If it offers me loving intent, if I offer it loving intent about wanting to talk about the psychology of kink, it'll give me material. If somebody comes in and wants to work on, their cross-dressing, it'll give me, I put loving intent to help them, and it'll feed me for that, to help them. But if I bring ego into it, if I bring some kind of old kink of mine, and I'm not talking about a sexual kink, I'm talking about some unconscious, moral taboo.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is I don't get punished, but the other world just bam, the connection just stops.
Mm.
It requires that sense of radical openness to love, radical commitment to doing right. And so in the second and third tier, we can feel when we're there and when we're not.
Right.
And then when we're not, we know what we need to do. We need to get that connection back, and then, evaluate from depending upon whatever is there for us to deal with.
And again, it comes down to also to just how complex development is. I mean, in a certain sense, saying something like when you've hit teal or turquoise is almost kind of meaningless, because it's like, what parts of you are you talking about?
That's
right? Are you talking about your identity line? Are you talking cognitively? Are you talking values? And I think the important thing, another important thing to remember is just because, you might say that just because you've hit teal or turquoise, that doesn't mean that you've become integrated. That means that you are now doing this ongoing process of integrating, right? And there's no destination that we ever really achieve. It's just this ongoing process where we have a little bit more transparency, a little bit more ability to respond to these drives and these pressures that we're feeling both within us and without us. And it's all part of a process. And I certainly do think there are probably some new sort of kinks, some new kind of twists of that sexual energy that can certainly come on at teal or turquoise.
Oh, of course. Well, development really, if you think about it, is the growth of our unconscious, what I call shadow. Ken and I disagreed a little bit about that, but that development means that we begin to shift our focus of interest as we enter different developmental stages. So at teal, we just get more interested in different perspectives.
Yeah.
We get more interested in when we have biases. That's just more interesting.
Yep.
That's an unconscious response that is a marker of a teal altitude. If I have a biased reaction with no interest in examining it, that's not a second tier reaction. That's a first tier reaction. Now, if I'm interested in that biased reaction, that's a second tier reaction to a first tier thing that has come up in me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so now at that level, when you are kind of stable half the time in the second tier, ongoing development is a characteristic of being stable. You're always, why? Because you realize that any perspective I have is just the best perspective I have now about myself or other people, and there's a better one down the road.
Yep.
Okay, that's an unconscious understanding. You can learn that consciously in a minute. To grow your unconscious so that your unconscious embodies that takes many years. Okay. And generally, apparently, it's accelerated by contemplative practice. It's accelerated by shadow work. Is one of the reasons I wrote my book, Shadow Light. It's contemplated. It's accelerated by integral mindfulness. It's accelerated by great relationships. It's accelerated by an awful lot of things. But there's a particular point where it's not a choice to serve your personal evolution. Serving your personal evolution is what you do.
Right.
It's like breathing.
Right.
And that's one of the signs that, you've shifted your center of gravity, upward a notch.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when it comes to sex, you're just kind of interested in where the charge is and where the fun is and what serves love and what serves your relationship. I feel a sense of responsibility in my relationship to have our sexual relationship feel alive and expanding. And why? Because that's my job to maintain our love and maintain my wife as my partner and friend and lover. And she feels a similar sense of responsibility.
Hmm.
Um, why? Well, that's because we know about it, but also because we're mostly second tier. That's what we want to do.
Right. Right.
Um,
Well, and it's interesting too, Keith, and we got a couple questions. We'll bring them on in just a moment. It's interesting
sure.
too how we can carry the same kink or set of kinks with us throughout our lives, and the way we relate to and enact those kinks changes as we continue to develop. So when we're at a very low level, it can be like, my kink is like what I need to get off. You know what I mean? By the
Oh
time
yeah.
you get green, it's like my kink is a part of my identity, and I need to express my identity. Maybe at teal and turquoise levels, it gets a little bit like, my kink is actually in certain ways causing suffering. And in order for me to get out of my own way, I have to find a way to fulfill these things so that I can become a little bit more transparent to myself. It's interesting. The kink stays the same, but the way we respond to and engage with that kink can really change pretty dramatically from decade to decade as we continue to grow and evolve.
Yeah,
So
it
I'm gonna
certainly reflects the fact that we have different moral systems that are informing us
totally.
about what's acceptable and not.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Absolutely. And the more sophisticated our stage of development, the more we can begin to notice how a kink in one line of development can actually, sort of simultaneously kink up other lines of development. So there's sort of an untangling process, I think.
well, and there's another question about sexual taboos of the second tier. And the question, how would you characterize sexual taboos at teal turquoise? Is it strictly a combination of the unintegrated aspects of previous levels, or are there new shadow aspects that show up? Um, so, first of all, taboos are interesting. Um, Often, taboos have been eroticized.
Mm.
So, breaking a taboo adds energy to a sexual occasion sometimes. Um, So now in the second tier, when a taboo shows up and we go, does breaking this taboo add energy to my sexual relationship in a way that's healthy? And if the answer is yes, then the taboo becomes a resource. Okay. Why the taboos still arise? They still arise out of our unconscious. We never lose our moral standards or previous moral standards. But as we observe them, they get processed radically differently in the second tier. And so if it's a taboo that's generally a good taboo, then let's follow it.
Mhm.
Generally a good taboo is if there's a beautiful woman at the beach, don't stare at her to make her uncomfortable. That's the taboo. If I do that, I should feel ashamed of myself.
Yep.
I support that taboo. Okay. Here's another taboo. I shouldn't give sexually ambiguous messages to somebody that seems to like me in some environment. Why? Because I'm feeding distracting attraction, and that's not a really good thing to do. I got a taboo around that. Okay. I think the taboo about having a secret affair and cheating on your partner is a pretty fine taboo. I mean, I hope people feel ashamed when they do stuff like that. And I hope that taboo stops people from doing it because it causes a lot of damage.
Yeah.
So, taboos arise in the second tier, but they get evaluated along those lines. What are the ones that serve love and when the ones that don't, that serve intimacy and serve development, and the ones and also, does violating that taboo actually make things better, or does violating that taboo actually make things worse? And at teal, you're open for both possibilities.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other, because like you said, we're all super complicated, and not more so than sexually. And just the fact that talking about sex is more difficult than, say, talking about digestion,
Yeah.
it's just a mark of cultural prohibitions in sex to go back thousands of years. I mean, it should be my thing as we develop as a culture. It'd certainly be great if we could talk about sexual development with the same ease that we talk about cognitive development or physical development.
Yep.
That's just not the case now.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I advocate a lot is talking about everything to your kids starting early. And that's really hard for modern parents to hear and to practice, and they don't very, very often.
Yep.
Now, my sense is my experience has been when that's happened, that's been good for kids. It certainly was for my kids.
Increasingly important in the age of easily available internet pornography.
Yeah, because if you're not communicating with your kids, then they don't have any contexts to process those vivid and highly energized images. And if a
Yep.
kid sees some porn thing that gets them off, but that violates, remember, they're concrete operational at 9 and 10, and even at 11 and 12, that gets them off, but is super forbidden by, say, their family or the culture. There's a huge shame problem that happens with that kid that, if it gets internalized, can create all kinds of distress later on.
Yep.
And I don't want that to happen to kids.
Yep.
I don't want that to happen to anybody.
Oh, totally. I mean, optimal sexual health is not being very well represented on the front page of Pornhub.
No, it's not. The Pornhub is regulated.
Right.
You know, everybody's over 18. You know, they have regulations. You know, that's okay. If there's going to be porn, regulated. If there's going to be prostitution, regulated. You know, like these BDSM communities, you know, they have a lot of standards. They have ceremonies where you award people their leather, you know, or their collar and stuff. Or, you know, people get, you know, some kind of piercing or something in a particular kind of way. And, you know, and those ceremonies are great ceremonies for them. And they recapitulate ceremonies that go back forever, with the Sioux Indians doing an awful lot of body stuff, a lot of blood stuff, and other cultures forever.
Yep.
You know, it's just, you know, we're just kind of taking our humanness and then getting more and more able to get the crap part of it out, the destructive part, you know, and keep the artistic part moving forward.
Right.
And that's the integral age.
That's right. Yeah, turning our drives into art. I thought that was such a beautiful line. So I'm going to bring Jay Rigson into the conversation.
Hey, Jay.
I'm going to promote you to panelist. Once you're over, I will unmute you. Hi there.
Hey, Jay.
This is Rigson. And yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you very much for having the conversation, because I've been on the sort of listening to every integral recording and podcast like for the last 15 years and never actually saying anything back kind of phase of life. So I just wanted to like actually say thank you, first of all.
Well, thank you.
But I also wanted to say how much I really related to your integralized definition of kink, in the sense, for me personally, how it really made a lot of sense is it took me till I was about 30 years old to fully come out and accept myself as being gay. And, you know, small town, Christian, you know, background, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a huge, huge, huge thing for me just to get to the point where I could, you know, say to myself I was gay, say to other people I was gay, start living my life that way. And so then as I started discovering myself sexually, what was interesting to me was that, and I started discovering that I was kinky, and there were certain kinks that I just enjoyed. I didn't have the same kind of problem accepting that. And I think it's because once, like if you've lived in a society that's told you your very way of wanting, you know, even relating to sex is in a sense already a kink, then once you've been able to accept that, then why should the fact that I want to be tied up, you know, be a big deal? You know, why? And I actually would have interesting conversations with gay friends who would themselves, let's say, be more vanilla in terms of their sex, and who would have problems with kink. And I would think, well, how can we be the ones who have any problem? Like I can say, I don't like that, I don't want to do that. But to actually say, oh, there's a problem with that, it just never made any sense to me. Once kind of that first, you know, took 30 years, but that first breakthrough was made. So just the contextualization of it that you gave, I thought was really, really fantastic. And I just wanted to thank you for it.
Well, you're welcome, Riggs. And also this explains why really the most fun bars that I've ever been in and parties have been gay bars and gay parties. Yeah, boy, if you want to get down, you know, to your serious self. And also I remember working with one guy. He was a bear, you know, he was a bare bottom. You know, if those of you, you know, big burly guys are bears, and the bottoms are people that like to be dominated, and tops are people who like to dominate. And, you know, he started getting all contemptuous of effeminate gay guys.
Right.
And I said, look, you're being a fucking bigot here. You know, geez, you know, really? I mean, it's okay that you're not into it, but boy, you know, you know, that kind of disapproval. What, they're supposed to now all of a sudden be bears instead of, you know, feminine gay guys? I mean, come on.
Yeah.
You know, and to his credit, he got embarrassed when I said that to him. So great.
Yeah.
I'm glad. Hey, look, I'm really glad that you got at peace with it. I'm glad that you accept who you are, and you apparently have people you can play with.
Yeah.
I'm just stoked about it, you know, and that's how we all should be, you know. And you're right. I think that once you come out as gay, you know, you've already made the struggle. It makes it easier, kind of, to be more accepting. And I think that's one of the reasons that gay people are heavily represented in the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom, in the Janus organization up north. You know, organizations, communities, Sangha really help us feel good about each other. They provide cultural standards and cultural support. The gay community has been doing that for 50 years, particularly since it stopped being illegal to be gay.
Right.
So, you know, good. Yeah. And so anyway, thanks for sharing. Thanks for coming back. Join us next time when we have our next talk.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I have been joining you. I just haven't been saying anything. So now I'll just be more vocal instead.
You are welcome to join anytime you want, Rick.
Well, once again, once you do it the first time, it's a lot easier to second, third, and fourth time.
Right.
Have to break through the barrier.
That's right. So everything today is a double entendre. Every single thing. And that's the other thing about sex. You can't talk about sex without having a double entendre about every second or third sentence.
Yeah, that's for sure.
It's funny, Keith, I'm getting into woodworking right now. And if you can watch a single episode of This Old House without giggling like a 9-year-old, you're a better man than me.
There you go.
Riggsden, thank you so much.
Thank
And let's see here. It looks like we've got another question from Loki. Loki, I'm bringing you on. Just one sec. Let's see here, the god of mischief himself. And we got you on, but we can't see you and we can't hear you. Let me try to unmute. Loki, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, how are you?
Okay.
There we go.
Let's see, a couple of things. First, quick background, and then a personal story example, and a more general question for Keith. By the way, I'm a naturist pagan long-term. I've been an activist, and I guess turned into a social revolutionary, despite a background in a conservative field like engineering for regulated industry. And going back before the web existed, I was, I guess, indirectly facilitating communities, running a private BBS, being an admin in several networks, including Adult Links, which at the time was the largest non-commercial wide-scale sexuality network in the world for quite a while. Anyway, one of my more interesting relationships historically was with a fellow Dom who at the time was between her second and third grad degrees and had lived in a castle in England for 3 years, which had an interesting side to her having in part paid her tuition by working as a pro-dom some of the time. But anyway, it was one of the few relationships, you know, where it was two DOMs together and playing switches with each other and negotiating a few things. Mm-hmm. Also, we were equal in age. She noticed she had apparently had a lot of older partners, but you know, that led to an interesting dynamic of intensity and balance together, which neither of us had found easy in most cases. But she had a shocking experience out of that. You know, we had been doing some generic social activities and discussing all sorts of things, then went into a scene session with each other, and I enabled her to go, I guess, farther than she was used to, and got a little out of control because of some level of trust and intensity that had developed. And the next day when we were discussing it, she panicked a bit. She had, in that case, I thought it was a safe space. I could have easily stopped things, but had gone beyond her own boundaries and any previous negotiation. And in effect, violated her own scene ethics. And that was scary to her.
Of course.
And yeah, but at least in a context where it was mutually safe and trusting, and I didn't consider it a problem after the fact. Anyway, moving on. Do you know who Paul Akami is?
Heard the name, but I don't associate it with anything. So
OKAMI. He, I think, is a 4S member, and an organization that probably deserves a lot more respect and notoriety than it has, or pretty much the standards to be a member or to be an expert witness in court.
Society for the Scientific Study of Sex. Of
sexuality, and it goes back, about 60 years now, I think. But about 1,500 members. Anyway, Paul Akami started at UCLA, and he ended up, I think he's emeritus now at Widener in Pennsylvania, which is one of the few, Northeastern 4S, recommended schools, doing the only birth to adulthood longitudinal study of kids who were raised as naturists or nudists.
Interesting.
What he found was, effectively a broader pool of evidence for something that was already hypothesized and proven piecemeal in European studies. You could interpret it as saying that textile compulsive parents are child abusers, but more specifically, by teenage years, the kids who were raised as nudists were typically about 18 months more developmentally mature in personal identity, boundary awareness, and consent skills, which of course really annoy the religious right, because that means you can say yes and you don't have to say no, but you have to know why you're doing it and have it be an active choice you're empowered with.
Got it. So your question is?
Well, first, I guess you're not familiar with Paul. He's also written a psych textbook which reflects that study and a generally sex positive attitude, which would be nice to see more schools adopt.
Well, of course.
But how could we change your profession so that it acts more professional rather than conspiring with marketing people and lawyers and politicians to promote traditional bigotry and oppression that causes a lot of those other secondary psych problems?
Okay, so first of all, you notice as Loki, did I call you Loki? Loki is one of my favorite archetypes.
I happen to be mostly Scandinavian and believe in a cosmology of orderly chaos.
Yeah, well, Loki, okay, there you go. Loki's one of my favorite archetypes, a personal avatar of sorts. Anyway, Loki's using a lot of language that's familiar language to people that are in the BDSM community. Switching is people that can be tops and bottoms at the same time. People talk about or enjoying scenes, and they talk about an increasing intensity. And also part of the discussion before a scene is about the intended and unintended consequences of a scene. An unintended consequence might be somebody goes a little farther than they're comfortable with before they use the safe word and stop, and then afterwards might feel distress, which requires some kind of intense, some kind of processing. I'm not surprised at all by the nudism studies. Why am I not surprised? Anytime that you have a culture that is focused on a certain kind of purity, that culture is a self-policing culture, okay? And so there's a lot of intent about kids being able to talk about what's going on and be able to express what's going on and be able and also be able to discuss what they're comfortable and uncomfortable with themselves. Now, I think that it's a little bit of a bridge too far to say that textile, parents that want to clothe their kids and have the kids not be naked is abuse. I think that's a little bit of a political statement, not as much a psychological statement.
It's less hyperbole than what you hear from them a lot of the time.
I understand.
And obviously it's a complex issue where there are a whole bunch of elements, like nudist and naturist parents tend to be higher socioeconomic status and probably have more skills and resources.
I'm aware of that. I spent my years at the nude beach. Also, I'm aware that mostly it's been guys talking. It bothers me that we don't have some women, talking about all this stuff. Not that the women would probably say much that was different, but it'd be nice to have some women having this conversation. look, the profession is moving in the right direction. You know, the 2013 DSM-5, I've never liked the DSM-5 much, you know, frankly, but it's a language that we all speak, and, you know, psychology needs to have a shared language, and it doesn't pathologize the paraphilias like it used to. I'm for that. We're generally moving in the general integral awakening to individual rights. That means individual identity and individual sexuality and stuff. So that we can have conversations like these and it's no big deal. And so that's happening. Along the way, there's going to be a lot of bullshit. And so what we don't want to do is we don't want to identify people by, one, their bullshit side, or organizations by the fact that every organization has some corrupt side that's going to look bad. And that's true for the APA, and it's true for the Psychiatric Association, it's true for every association. And our organizations grow less quickly than the advancing edge of the profession. And that's just the nature of organizations and standards and all that kind of stuff. But it's going in the right direction. And so stuff like this, stuff like what you're saying, all this stuff is moving the bar forward. You know, and then 100 years from now, they'll look back and they'll go, I can't believe they used to have this stuff. Just the same way that we look back at the Spanish Inquisition, or we look back at female circumcision with horror, even though it's still happening, and go, look, you know, we're not doing that today. Well, that's going to keep happening as evolution progresses. And that's a beautiful thing. Yeah. So thank you for joining us, Loki.
Well, thank you for the topic. I was interested in seeing how you'd approach it. You know, obviously, with an audience that may have some people who are experienced, others who are introductory level, and it's a difficult task trying to do all that at once.
Well, it is. Yeah, and in the BDSM community, there's people that are good at it and people that aren't good at it. And there's a lot of associations and conferences that teach, and books and videos and stuff that can help people be better tops and better bottoms, and better at everything. And I like that. I like the organizations coming together and creating experiences and standards and permission and that kind of stuff.
There's a lot of community conflict too. You know, like I had mentioned in comments before, you know, the evolution from SSC that you were struggling with before, safe, sane, and consensual is the standard for that acronym, to RAC, or risk-aware consensual kink. And I know, just as a technical and administrative person in an international network, you know, basically tried to draw a line between what will get the network in trouble because of insane conflicted laws here and there.
Yes,
and are people?
I'm sorry, I interrupted.
But that one's pretty messy on its own. That could take a 3-year seminar. But the other one is, and you know, when people are complaining about other people, which happens regularly, and usually not knowing the full story unless they're connected personally, are they actually complaining about something that is in fact unsafe, or do they just not know, you know, that this person actually has some medical skills, or with electronics, or, you know, structural rigging? And, you know, there are a lot of skills in kink communities that are invisible and don't come across online, particularly when you're maintaining privacy and confidentiality.
That's right. And also, I like risk-aware consensual sex, because risk-aware consensual sex emphasizes the principle that when two people enter in and consult with each other and create something, that there are going to be intended and unintended consequences, and you can't take consent back proactively. You can't say, oh, I take my consent back yesterday. You can't do that. You know, if there's an unintended, I know, but if there's an unintended consequence, then what you do is we process unintended consequences in a supportive, dialectical, and loving way. And we're available for that. And that's a standard in the communities that I'm aware of. And I like that standard.
I've been surprised. Like one time it turned out.
We need to give somebody else a chance.
Oh, okay. Anyway, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you, Loki. All right, so it looks like we have another question from Nina. All right, Nina, I am bringing you over. Give me just a sec.
There.
A woman.
Well, that's why I didn't actually have a question, but you asked for a woman to engage, and I've been thoroughly enjoying this.
Oh, good.
So it turns out I actually do have a question. You know, having been, I guess I was born in '58, so that gives you an idea of I was raised right at the cusp of when women just finally, we got sort of emancipated sexually. So, I have the background of the repressive, parents and grandparents kind of, but culturally the openness, and I liked exploring, and I was really I was active before I was mature enough to be active. So I got to experience what that's about. And I totally endorse that concept where you talk about age appropriate experiment. If there'd been more age appropriate experimentation allowed, I would have had a much healthier trajectory.
Yeah, good.
However, my question is, now that I'm at an advanced age, I'm still young, and I believe in euthanasia, spelt with a Y. I'm interested in finding, okay, so how do I start, what are some ways that I could start exploring my inner kink? Like what are some things that I could do to open more and become aware of it? Because honestly, I don't have a clue what my inner kink is anymore.
Well, first of all, just that question is going to open things up. It's interesting that 50 Shades of Grey sold, I don't know, 150 million copies and made $60 million a movie. And the movie wasn't that great, but it made $60 million.
I thought that was just female porn, so I didn't read it.
Well, it was okay. I got nothing against female porn. It's just wasn't that interesting. But my point about it is, one, hang around. First of all, it's really useful to be aware of what you like and what you don't like, and just be curious about it. Have friends you can talk to about it, particularly other women, friends. And when you date guys, if it's a guy that can talk, find guys that you date who can talk comfortably about your sexuality and their sexuality. Now, when you're doing that, then out of that comes fantasy. Out of that comes interest. Out of that comes curiosity. Curiosity is a really beautiful trait. The wise self in us, that part of us that is deep and wise and compassionate and so on. That part is curious, and it's not just curious about the world; it's curious about us. Okay, and so it's really useful to say, okay, well, I'm curious about my emerging sexuality as a 50-year-old woman. I'm curious about it, and I want a partner who's curious about it, so we can be curious together. Okay, and so I encourage you to do that stuff. I encourage everybody, frankly. Now, some people don't care to expand their sexuality, which of course they don't have to expand their sexuality. Some people don't. Some people make all kinds of decisions. But for those of us that want to continue to grow on our psychosexual line, being on this call is expansive. Okay. Being curious about what you're interested in, and also what disgusts you. Okay, that's kind of interesting. Being interested and also noticing who can I be transparent with and who not. Because if you have a lover, you want a lover you can be transparent with, and who's transparent with you. And
I am blessed with that.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, I don't know how transparent he is with me, but I don't feel like there's anything I can't say to him.
Well, you might want to watch this video with him on Integral Life, when it gets published. And so, we get to this part of it and I go, well, it seems like Nina is kind of available to talk about a lot of stuff. Maybe you can open up and talk about a lot of stuff and trust her to have radical acceptance of you. Okay. And so that's to your lover. Okay. And so when you get to this part of the video, then he has a personal message from Keith encouraging him to open up with you. That's the best I can do, Nina.
Thank you. Thank you for this whole conversation. It's wonderful.
I'm glad you're enjoying it. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, thank you, Nina.
Bye-bye.
The one thing I thought of as she was talking was that, I don't want people who are watching us right now to feel this sort of like pressure that it's like, oh shit, everyone's got a kink. What's mine? I need one too. For some people, vanilla is their kink. And that's totally cool. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that either.
It's funny how vanilla is a pejorative.
I love it. It's like my favorite vanilla. It's like the most complex flavor. I love vanilla.
Well, vanilla happens to be everybody's favorite flavor of ice cream.
Right.
When they did studies on it.
Yeah.
But you know, there is somewhat of a subtle diss of vanilla in the kink community, you know, of vanilla sex, you know, of heteronormative sex. But that's how it works with subcultures, right? There's always an inside and outside. You always prefer your subculture a little bit.
Yep.
So, you know, you're not going to not have that, but it's good to make that an object of awareness, you know, to see it and smile about it.
That's right. Well, Keith, this has been an awesome call. And before we close, I just want to read this short message from Rigzin, who wrote back in, just because I think this is absolutely beautiful. And I think it's a really nice capstone to our conversation. So he says, the other thing I meant to say was to affirm Keith's teal-related comments. I enter my kinky relationships with as much of a desire to be a conduit for love as I would in any other relationship. And the added intensity that is generated can create an even greater potential to be a conduit for love, or at least another portal for giving and receiving love. I think that is absolutely gorgeous. I think it is a beautiful summary of second-tier sexuality, where the goal is literally to make love, to add to the sum total of love that exists in this universe. And I just thought that was really beautiful, and I really couldn't have phrased it better myself.
Rigzin obviously has depth and skills in this area. I'm glad that he contributed.
Yeah, same here. Well, Keith, man, thank you so much. This has been an awesome episode. I've got to take off these nipple clamps. I'm starting to shake a little bit.
Much love to everybody. Go have a Valentine's Day. Have a lot of fun. Have a vanilla fun, or have kinky fun, or have kinky vanilla fun. Have whatever kind of fun you want to have, because I love you having fun.
That's right. And make more love, people. Make more love. Thank you, guys. And we'll see you next month for another episode of Wit and Wisdom. In the meantime, I'm Corey DeBose, Mr. Keith Witt. Sorry, Dr. Keith Witt. And we'll talk to you guys soon.
Bye-bye, everybody. Much love.